All right, it is 6:05. We're going to go ahead and get this meeting started. So again, thank you for those who are joining us today, and welcome to the Havana Street Corridor public meeting. During this meeting, there will be two opportunities to provide input, or two ways to provide input. And you are welcome to provide those to us now. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask any questions or provide comments. Or text your questions or comments to 720-270-9041. As I mentioned earlier, we would love to hear from 100 more people. So please take our survey located at auroragov.org/Havana Street Corridor Study and share it with others. This survey will be open until October 14th, and it only takes about 10 minutes to complete. Just to let everybody know, we will be recording this meeting so that we can post it on the website and share with those who could not be part of this outreach opportunity tonight. And with that, my name is Jennifer Carpenter. I work with Michael Baker, and I'm managing the project from the consultant side. Today, we're going to go over a couple features in Zoom to get you familiar with the platform, and then we'll go over your role in this project, an overview of the project, and the corridor-wide conditions. We'll talk about areas that we identified that might require some additional detailed focus, and then we'll get into next steps. But before we do that, I would like to introduce the city's project manager for this project. His name is Huilong Liu.
Thank you, Jennifer. You hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you all for coming to this important first public meeting for the Havana Street Corridor Study. Again, this is a transportation study. Oh, first, as Jennifer said, I'm a principal transportation planner with the city planning department, and also I'm the project manager for the project on the city side. Havana Street is a very important street corridor for the city, from the economic development, multimodal functions, and creating places. So the purpose of this project is to identify ways to make this corridor better, safer, and more efficient for all users. Whether you're driving, you're taking transit, or you're walking, or if you're wanting to ride bikes, even we don't have bicycle lanes today on Havana Street. So it is very important that you participate and you engage in this process and provide your input. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge several our city council members. I believe just going through the screen, I see Council Member Curtis Gardner. He is the at-large city council member, and also Council Member Juan Mercano. He's the Council Member Ward 4. And I believe Council Member Allison Hughes is also planning to join us. And also we have Planning Director George Adams at the meeting as well. And we have reps from RTD and CDOT, and if you have any specific questions, they will be glad to address as well. So with that, I'm wondering if any council members would like to say a few words with the public. All right.
Sure. Sorry, Huilong, I had a
go ahead, please.
Muting. Yeah, I won't say much, but I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their evening to join us. I want to thank you all for putting this together. As you said, this is such a critical corridor, not just for Ward 4, but for the whole city from a economic standpoint, but also, going forward from an activity standpoint and from a residential standpoint. So I'm really excited to see the presentation, and I hope that we get a lot of engagement from the folks who are here. So thanks again.
Thank you, Council Member Mercano. Also, I'd like to acknowledge Chance. She's the Executive Director for Havana Business Improvement District. She has been a critical team member from the beginning of the project because Havana BID is a very important stakeholder with the project. So we really appreciate all the help Havana BID, especially Chance, has provided for this project. So with that, I'd like to turn back to Jennifer.
Thanks, Huilong. All right. So Zoom guidance. This evening, as I mentioned, you'll have two opportunities or two ways to provide feedback and comments and ask questions throughout the meeting. The Zoom Q&A option is your first option here. As you can see on the screen, there is also a chat button, but the chat is disabled, so you won't be able to use it. So if you have any comments, any questions, click the Q&A button, type in any questions or comments you have, and there will be points throughout this public meeting where we will go ahead and address questions and comments. And we may not be able to get through all of them tonight, but we are compiling a list of all the questions and comments that we get, and we will provide those on the website after this meeting. The other option, again, if you want to provide questions or comments, is via texting if the Q&A button is not working for you tonight. And you can text 720-270-9041. All right, so the public is a very important piece to this project. We hope that we get out of this meeting perspectives from community and business owners, all of you today. We want to identify mobility, land use, and area needs that you all are aware of, because while we've done our analysis, you all are the experts. So it's important that you provide that information to us so that we can include that in our analysis. And we're hopeful that all of you will share the information that you learned today with your friends and neighbors. And we're going to make that really easy for you, because we're going to post the PowerPoint and the presentation on the website like we have in the past. So that will be very easy. If you could just spread the word, we'd really appreciate it. Alrighty, so we're going to dive into the project overview. The Havana Corridor is a 6-mile study area. It is a successful, vibrant, and growing area. But with that success has come increased traffic and multimodal needs to accommodate the demands of the users. With this study, we look at how to support the success of the corridor by improving the safety and mobility for all users. The study area encompasses a half-mile radius around Havana Street from Montview Boulevard on the south to, or Montview Boulevard on the north, excuse me, down to Dartmouth Avenue on the south end. We've established some goals for this project to make it successful as we consider the existing and future users and mobility demands on this corridor. It's important to balance the types of uses, the modes of travel, and focus on safety for all users, because that will promote the economic viability of this corridor. It's also important to us to maintain an identity of a cultural hub. This basically means that we want to celebrate the diversity of the businesses on Havana and ensure their future success. We know that they've gone through a lot of really hard times with COVID, and this is providing us an opportunity to really get some good feedback and do something important on this corridor. So we'll jump into existing conditions. We'll talk about demographics and pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and vehicle conditions along the corridor, as well as land use. However, before we do that, we do have a question for all of you. We'd like to know how you would describe biking, walking, transit use, and driving in the Havana Corridor study area today. We'd like to ask you to provide your responses using the Q&A button or by texting to 720-270-9041. And as you all provide those responses to us, we will talk through the existing conditions that we've identified. And then once we get through that section, we will come back to your responses and what you've told us today. And we'll also at that point allow for questions or comments. Please feel free to include those at any point, and we will touch on those throughout the project when we have the opportunity. Prior to starting our analysis, we reviewed a number of studies to ensure that we captured all the goals, recommendations, and future plans along the corridor. This here shows a list of all of those studies that we reviewed. We also looked at demographics in the corridor. So if you look at demographics within 1 mile of the corridor, we can see that there are 25% of the population is young or elderly, and nearly half are minorities. There's also a large percentage for which English is their second language. Unfortunately, the median income in this area is 18% lower than the city of Aurora as a whole. And there's a large percentage of people that do not own a car in this corridor, which points to a high reliance on transit. However, with the anticipated increase in jobs that we're expecting in this corridor, along with recent development, it shows that this area is vibrant and growing. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ted Hyde from Alta Planning and Design. They are supporting the bike and pedestrian portion of this project.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. A quick audio check first. You can hear me?
I can hear you.
Excellent, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Like Jennifer said, thank you for joining us. Appreciate you being here and taking the time, and mostly looking forward to seeing what questions you have, comments you have, suggestions. Like Jennifer said, you, of all the people on the call, you as business owners or key stakeholders know the corridor so well. So we look forward to, hope to hear from you. So the next dozen slides or so, we're going to walk you through some of our findings and initial conclusions about the bicycle and pedestrian environment. You might say the bicycle pedestrian experience out on the corridor. Just to give you a look at what we found as the kind of existing conditions, baseline conditions, before we move into conceptual recommendations later in the project. So let's start off with sidewalks and talking about existing pedestrian conditions. I think it's fair to say that on Havana, and you've seen it firsthand, there are a number of people who live nearby or on the corridor who mostly rely on walking as a mode of transportation, or partially, or for folks who are visiting the corridor, even if they are arriving there by private automobile, part of their trip may include walking to a destination. So we looked at those conditions for pedestrians, and one of the things that really stood out to us is that there is such a mix and variety of sidewalk conditions out on the corridor from north to south. And here's an example right in front of the Family Dollar near Fifth Avenue, where due to the redevelopment, they successfully implemented what could really be described almost as a multi-use path. This is probably 8 to 10 feet wide, level grade, it's in great condition, separated from Havana by a nice landscape buffer there. So this is a really positive example of the sidewalk currently out there on the corridor. If we advance to the next slide, this is just a quarter block down. So what we transition to here, and I'd ask you to put your visualization hat on as a pedestrian. You're walking past the Family Dollar southbound on Havana. You pass that business, and then you transition into what is looks like a commercial parking lot. As a pedestrian, you're uncertain. You don't know, is this a sidewalk? Is it a parking lot? I'm not sure. And if you continue south, you advance into what is a very nondescript, unimproved portion of the roadway or the right-of-way. It currently doesn't have any pavement at all next to this vacant facility. So this really is to point out you go from a very good facility that meets standard and is very accommodating for pedestrians in a kind of a nondescript area, and then into a very kind of uncertain, unimproved area. Next slide, please. All right, and what we noticed in a lot of locations, and don't take this as a rule, this is not a definition of the pedestrian environment on Havana, but we did find in a number of cases, and I draw your attention to the arrow here behind the pickup, or in the right-hand exhibit, the proximity of the sidewalk to the lane of travel for motorists, we have some real width issues, or you might say narrowness issues. In the photo at left, that sidewalk is probably no more than 36 inches. Now, if you put a tape measure on the ground, and you very quickly realize that as an individual pedestrian, or certainly if you're walking alongside a fellow pedestrian, whether it be a child, elderly, whatever, your right of way and your width is very constrained, and it's very difficult to walk side by side. And that applies to the image on the left or the right. The issue with the image on the right is that by walking along a facility like that, you have little to no separation from the lane of travel. So if a vehicle were to depart from the lane of travel, or if a pedestrian were to accidentally step out into the lane of travel, which is more possible on such a narrow facility, there's limited room for error, shall we say. So we found facilities like this, most especially in the northern half of the corridor. I would say mostly between Colfax and Montview. Next slide, please. Okay, and in a lot of locations, and again, this is not the definition of all intersections and curb ramp, but we did find in a lot of locations that these narrow sidewalks, when they meet intersections, they transition into what are substandard curb ramps, where either the slope, lack of truncated domes, or the angling of the ramp and how it's oriented to the intersection are substandard. And they pose issues for pedestrians. And what I mean by that is reliable access to both the intersection and opportunities for crossing. Whereas some crosswalks on the corridor do meet standard and are designed to current code, and they're edged by really well-maintained crosswalks, there are several that are not. So that poses an issue for pedestrians. Next slide, please. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, and we did identify in our existing conditions report that in several segments of the corridor, there are up to a half-mile in distance. Excuse me, I'm gonna turn this phone up here. A half-mile in distance between marked crosswalks or improved crosswalks where pedestrians clearly have the right of way. So what that can result in, and I'm sure you've seen this out on the corridor, is jaywalking, where you have pedestrians taking the most convenient path of travel and crossing the corridor in an unmarked location. Now, you know from the volumes as well as the speeds on Havana that can present issues. And here you see a pedestrian trying to cross in an unmarked location, and he is going to have to very carefully select the timing of when he is going to cross. So for both motorists as well as pedestrians, this presents safety concerns and issues. Next slide, please. Okay, and lighting. Lighting is a very important factor when you think about pedestrian comfort, pedestrian safety, and pedestrian access. If you're in an environment, and especially in the after dark hours, and you are walking, whether it be to a transit stop, to a business, to a residence, both for a perceived and real safety and comfort level, ideally you want to have lighting that illuminates the entire public right of way. Also, especially at intersections, you want to have sufficient illumination between motor vehicles and pedestrians to reduce the potential for conflict, especially at those higher speed turning movements where motorists may be turning onto Havana or off of Havana. A pedestrian may be attempting to cross. If you have a deficient level of lighting, that presents real safety concerns. Next slide, please. All right, so our key takeaways, and then we'll move on to bicycles. Our key takeaways is that, generally speaking, because of the lack of continuity or consistency on many portions of the corridor between what type of sidewalk it is, where it is, what conditions it is in, generally speaking, that adds up to stressful pedestrian conditions. If you're attempting to walk on the corridor, the inconsistency and the unpredictability in some locations, not all locations, create stressful conditions for walking. Now, there is an element of risk and danger, and that's not unique to Havana. Let me say that right out of the gate. But pedestrian-involved collisions only made up 2% of total crashes. However, it did result, 50% of them were either fatal or resulted in some sort of injury to the pedestrian. And more on the positive side, and I think the upside, and we'll recognize this in biking too, you guys know that on the corridor, there are 3 connections to off-street multi-use greenways, off-street multi-use paths. And so that provides tremendous connections, opportunities for better connecting pedestrians to those paths. And when we look at the future of Havana. Next slide, please. Okay, so bicycling. We long said this at the very beginning of the presentation, but there are currently no designated bicycle facilities on Havana. People do ride on it. This gentleman right here is riding on what is probably an undefined social trail, which is an unimproved area that people use for walking and biking, but it's not a sidewalk. But there are, when you think about Havana, your section of it, most relevant to you or other sections, what we found is that there are no dedicated bicycle lanes, there are no shared lane markings, there are no vertically separated bike lanes. They just don't exist on Havana. Next slide. Okay, riding in the lanes of travel is legal. Under Colorado Vehicle Code, bicycles are vehicles, so they are permitted to ride in any section of Havana as a vehicle. However, I've ridden the corridor, I've driven the corridor, I've walked it, and I think I'm a confident cyclist, but I would best describe it as stressful. Number of lanes, average speeds, the volume, the complexity of turning movements. For most of your bicyclists out there in Aurora or elsewhere, this is the type of facility that would be defined as stressful. And again, the sidewalk conditions are generally inconsistent. So for riding, that creates kind of an unpredictable experience as a bicyclist. Next slide, please. Okay, however, upside here. So very rough approximation by the red lines of where both off-street multi-use trails and on-street bike lanes and bike ways exist. So that is Havana right down the middle in the yellow. And what you can see is while that Havana is connected to a number of different facilities, so that's a positive thing, is also right in the middle of those. And is it, I'd ask you to think, is it serving more as a connector, those facilities, or is it serving more as a barrier in terms of getting across the corridor or north and south in the corridor to those facilities? So I did want to call out that there are east-west bike lanes at 4 locations immediately adjacent to the corridor. And most notably, many of you have seen it, maybe ridden it. Moline-Lima parallel bike lane extends for about 3 miles, come from kind of the middle of the study area down to its southern end. But we did note that on the west side of Havana, there is definitely a shortage of east-west on-street bike lanes. So that's something we note and a possible deficiency to be addressed in the recommendation. Next slide, please. Okay, so our takeaways for bicycling, then I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer, who's going to discuss transit. That there were a lower number of total crashes involving bicycles on the corridor, but it's very similar to pedestrian. 50% of those did result in injuries of some kind. Riding is permitted in lanes, but it's generally highly stressful due to volumes and speeds. Sidewalk riding is permissible, but the conditions are often inconsistent. I'm going to end on a very positive note here with Cherry Creek Trail, with Colgate Creek Trail, and with the, I'm blanking on the third one, Highline Canal Trail. Tremendous opportunity for improving connections to those off-street multi-use trails at many points along Havana. So that's the bike pet story for now. Looking forward to your questions, and I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer to talk about transit.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Jen.
And I was skimming the Q&A questions, but was wondering, did you see any questions for Ted that we might want to address at this point in the game?
Well, first of all, hats off to participants because there is a hearty stream of questions and comments coming in, which is wonderful to see. Ted, the only thing that came in for you was asking about the Highline Canal and if that would be addressed in this study, which you just touched upon. So if there's any other thoughts around that that you wanted to elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So yes, the answer is yes. We've identified it from the very beginning as a key amenity kind of transecting the Havana corridor. And yes, the Highline Canal Trail and the connection point east-west of the corridor sit squarely within one of our focus areas that'll be talked about later in the presentation. So how we improve awareness of the fact that the trail is even there and then enhance comfortable, safe connections to the trail on both sides of the corridor is definitely going to be a part of the recommendations we're developing later in the study.
Great. And then one additional question did come in, and it was about the map. This person asked, why doesn't this map have red lines showing the Jewel Potomac Bikeway, or whatever the proper term is? They say that the bike lanes, shared lanes extend almost to Havana, so it might be something that you'd want to consider including.
Okay, good. Well, no, that's just the type of thing we want to hear. So yeah, perhaps an oversight we didn't catch, but we are recording all of these questions and comments. So as we get into recommendations and revise these maps, that is something we'll take into account. So thanks for bringing it up.
Okay. So we will go ahead and head on to the transit conditions along the corridor. So Route 105 is the route that runs up and down Havana Street corridor. It is a very high ridership corridor or ridership route. It serves 6,000 riders per day. It is the second highest ridership bus route that doesn't go downtown, and it's the 7th highest ridership bus route overall within the region. It does serve 48 bus stops, and it connects to 11 east-west routes along the corridor, including the 15L, which runs on Colfax. And just so you all are aware, the 15L is the 3rd highest ridership bus route in the region after the Mall Ride and the Flatiron Flyer. We also looked at amenities, or we looked at amenities for the transit piece and identified that 31% of the stops along the corridor have none. They have no benches and no shelters. 42% of the stops do have benches, but only benches, and 27% of the stops have both shelters and benches. What's important to note about this is that all of those 31% of stops that have no amenities are the very low ridership routes. So those amenities are serving a very large population of the ridership along this corridor. And in some cases, the ridership is so high that the additional benches or shelters may be needed in the future because there's so many people at those routes, at those stops. We also considered lighting. Lighting, as Ted had mentioned, is very important for the pedestrian realm. We looked at each of the bus stops along the corridor and identified how close or far away the lights were. If they were within 50 feet of the stop, we considered that to be good. If they were further than 50 feet from the stop, we considered that bad. North of 6th Avenue and south of Jewel Avenue, we have very poor lighting. The bus stops are dark in the evening. It makes it unwelcoming for riders, and as the days start to get shorter, that becomes more problematic even in the evenings during the rush hour. We identified the transit travel speed along the corridor, which was 13 miles per hour, and that's an average across the entire corridor. So it includes the buses stopping for at bus stops to pick up riders, and it also includes stopping at signals. The average bus delays are 4 minutes. So what that means is you have a scheduled time that the bus is supposed to arrive, but on average, the bus is up to 4 minutes late arriving at each of its stops. Based on this data and some other data that we compiled, the level of service for transit along the corridor is considered generally average. The good news is that there are some transit improvements that have been funded. The city won a grant to make some improvements to transit, and those improvements are intended to increase the efficiency, the reliability, and the overall performance of the transit corridor. So that includes things like bus bypass lanes and queue jumps, which allow the bus to get ahead of the traffic signal before the cars are able to go. It includes relocating some of the bus stops to make them more efficient, including bus bulbs that make it safer for pedestrians, and other more technical improvements such as adding transit signal priority, which again helps the buses get through the traffic signals more quickly. Whoops, excuse me. Okay, so the transit key takeaways. There's very high ridership on this corridor and somewhat limited amenities. There are some areas of poor lighting that we identified, and there's low travel speed with high delays. But the good news is that there are improvements to come. So I'll go ahead and dive into the vehicle conditions along the corridor, and then we can check and see if there's any additional questions for the transit and vehicle pieces of this. So looking at vehicle conditions, the corridor again is 6 miles long. It's anywhere from 2 to 8 lanes in width, and the posted speed limit is anywhere from 30 to 45 miles per hour. The number of cars driving along the corridor varies greatly as well. North of Colfax, you have about 10,000 cars per day driving on that section of Havana. But then when you get down to the intersection with Iliff, you have closer to 48,000 cars per day going through that intersection. So what that means is that the solution for this corridor is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We've got a wide variety of conditions, and we have to consider that as we move forward with recommendations on this study. However, the one common theme that we did notice is that there's a lack of available right-of-way to widen the road. So widening the road to add bike lanes or add wider sidewalks is not really an option at this point. We also looked at vehicle delay. So as you're driving along the corridor, how much delay are you experiencing at the signalized intersections and or because of just a congested roadway? And what we noted is that there's areas of minor delay, which are shown in green. So everything from 6th Avenue North to Montview. We identified areas with longer delays, which would be between 6th Avenue and down to Dartmouth. And then we identified areas that had the longest delays, which not surprisingly, Iliff, the intersection of Iliff and Havana is the location with the longest delays. And as a reminder, that is also the location with the highest volume. So you have the most number of cars trying to get through that intersection, and there's only so much you can do. So we also looked at crashes, and from 2012 to 2019, we identified approximately 7,500 crashes along the corridor. What's interesting to note about the vehicle crashes is that all of the fatal ones, which are shown here with red stars, occurred at signalized intersections. That's something that's kind of key and something that we are going to look at as we move forward with this project. So the key takeaways for the vehicle component is that we anticipate increased development, which is going to increase traffic. There is limited right-of-way, so we can't really widen the road to add new amenities. So we've got to work with what we've got. And that's going to require some creative solutions to reduce vehicle demand and congestion. So what we plan to do is to consider multimodal improvements as one of the ways to accommodate future demand. Before we jump into the land use piece of this, are there any questions, Anne, on the transit or vehicle or even the bike ped components that we'd like to touch on?
Sorry, it took a moment to get to the unmute button. We did have a question going back to Sidewalk conditions and lighting and greenery. And the person asked, is there a plan for widening the sidewalks along the corridor and also adding greenery and lights?
Well, this is Ted from Alta. I don't know the answer to that in terms of planned or funded capital improvements. So I would turn that question, please, if I could, to Huilan, if he could chime in on that.
Excuse me, Anne, can you please repeat the question one more time?
Absolutely. Is there a plan to widen sidewalks and also add greenery and lights?
Okay, okay. Yeah, as Jennifer mentioned, right-of-way constraint is a major limiting factor for this project, for this corridor. We certainly will identify ways to widen the sidewalk, because as you see, there are many segments, especially north of 6th Avenue. There are very narrow segments of sidewalks. They just don't meet our standard at all. And however, there's traffic, and there's people's front yards, so there's also parking. So very limited real estate essentially. So it is a very challenging situation for us to how do we do that. So the next phase of the project is for us to look at potential solutions and alternatives to make those improvements.
I'll just add to that, Elaine. This is Cheney Bostic, and I wanted to also mention that the city has a Havana Street Overlay District, which does require wider sidewalks be put in when a property does redevelop or add an addition or make an improvement to the property.
That is a very good point. That's typically what you see along the corridor, where you have better sidewalk conditions, better landscaping. Typically those areas, those improvements were associated with, was made with the redevelopment.
Great, and then we had one additional question, and Ted, I think that you could probably respond to this around bike comfort and how we're thinking about that. The question is, it seems that we need more bike lanes that are physically protected. If we're going to have bike lanes where women and children don't feel comfortable riding because of proximity to cars, then why should we build them?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, and I've been tracking the thread of comments as they've been coming through, and many of you have commented both on not only the volumes of vehicles, but also the speeds. A few of you, in fact, have used the word scary or something very like it to describe it in terms of bicycle and pedestrian experience. So in response to the question, a protected bike lane, for those of you who don't know, very quickly, is a lane or a facility designated specifically for bikes, and it provides some form of vertical separation from the motorized lane of travel. And that could be a vertical flex post, that could be a 6-inch or an 8-inch curb of some type to separate people from the lane of travel. Protected bike lanes are something we will consider as we get into the recommendations phase. However, that is going to need to be thoughtfully and carefully balanced with the other modes that we're talking about on the border. Motorized travel, single occupancy vehicle travel, and the needs for transit also serve the corridor. So while we do realize the greatest number of existing and prospective bicyclists would respond best to a protected facility on the corridor, we're going to need to be thoughtful and strategic about whether that would work given the other modes and needs on the corridor.
Great, and then we had a couple more questions, Jen, that came in about safety in vehicles and crashes. And to those who asked these, if you're looking for details and really to get into the weeds, the existing conditions report is available, I believe, on the website for your reading weekend enjoyment. But Jen, the two questions, if you have any maybe higher level takeaways, how many fatal crashes have there been, including cars and pedestrians along the corridor? And also, if you know, is there a particular area or intersection where the accidents occurred?
So I don't recall off the top of my head how many fatal crashes we had for the vehicle conditions. We did break it out for bikes, peds, and vehicle conditions, and all of that data, as Anne mentioned, is in the report. But going back to this slide here, each of these red stars represents a fatal crash at a signalized intersection. So we've got one at Colfax, First Avenue, Alameda, help me here guys, just south of Alameda, between Alameda and Exposition. We've got one at Mississippi, between Florida and Jewel at that signal, and then at Iliff. So, you know, we do have all of that data. We can provide any additional detail in the comments and responses that we'll provide at the end of this meeting. But a lot of that data is in the existing conditions report.
Great, and then there's a couple more questions coming in around design considerations. So one of them speaking to, would we consider a median to reduce people crossing, pedestrians crossing 3 to 6 lanes of traffic, and the specific location of Iliff and 6 is called out. And the second part of design is around technology potentially, and using something like red light cameras to reduce people running red lights.
Sure, I can respond to those. So we know that there is a small section of this 6-mile corridor that does already have medians. It is certainly something that's on our radar to consider. When we think about the various stakeholders, we've got the businesses, we've got the residences, we've got the peds and the bicyclists, and everyone has a different opinion about whether a median is the right way to go. So as we move forward with this project, the next time that we come back to you guys, we will have recommendations, and that may very well be one of them. As for red light cameras, I have personally had conversations with a police department in the region who has a couple red light cameras, and what they've told me is that you end up sometimes causing more crashes by putting them in, because people will slam on their brakes and then it ends up with a rear end crash. I don't know if, Ted, you've had any other experiences or observations around red light cameras or medians, but
Hey,
welcome to your thoughts as well.
chime in on that?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, who is that?
This is Carly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if you guys are aware, but the city used to have red light cameras, and the red light cameras went to a vote of the citizens back about a year or two ago, and they were actually voted out and are not allowed in the city anymore because of that. So red light cameras aren't an option in Aurora, and that's just because it's what the public didn't want them. So just wanted to add that in.
Sure. Thank you, Carly.
Yep.
And Carly is the city's traffic engineer.
Yes, sorry about that. Hi, everyone. I'm the city traffic manager. I'm Carly Camposano.
Thank you.
And Jen, very quickly in regards to the medians, yes, as part of the recommendations development, we'll be looking at, as I mentioned, there are a few segments where the distances between marked crosswalks are more notable. We're going to be looking at those segments in relation to where crashes are occurring and the severity of those crashes. And as Jennifer said, the concept of pedestrian refuge islands, to some degree in the middle of the roadway or near the middle of the roadway to establish a crosswalk or reduce the crossing distance is something we're going to look at.
Thanks, Ted. Ann, did we have any other questions at this point?
One last one just came in. What about reducing lane width so that we could make space for wider sidewalks in a bus lane?
Carly, I would love it if you, this is Ted here, I would love it if you could talk about whether the existing lane widths on Havana are typically probably 11 to 12. And if the city has a minimum standard, reductions would be feasible at any point on the corridor.
Hey, this is Carly again. I think our general standard is 12. Our minimum on an arterial like this is normally 11. But I just also want to add that Havana is a CDOT corridor, so we would go with their standards as well. So we'd probably have to look and do some specific measurements to see what would be feasible or not. But just from driving the corridor, I don't feel like we have a whole lot of extra width to play with. But it's definitely something I think we can maybe look at in more detail.
We do have CDOT traffic staff member here. I don't know whether.
Hi.
CDOT
This is Ben. This is Ben Keeney. I don't know if you can hear me now.
We can hear you.
Yeah, so we have similar lane width requirements of, I think, 11 feet for this kind of corridor is pretty typical. So yeah, we probably have a similar answer to the city there.
Thanks, Ben. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and jump into the land use piece of this. Cheney Bostic is with Studio Seed, and she is assisting us with the land use component for this study.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just go through 3 quick slides here talking about, along the 6 Mile corridor, we will also be looking outside of the right-of-way, what we call land use. In other words, what's happening on the private property of properties fronting Havana. We used an organizing principle from Aurora Places, which is the city's comprehensive plan. That was just, it's brand new, pretty much, updated a couple years ago. And so we've divided the corridor into 3 segments. Original Aurora is what's shown here on the screen. And so that's from the northerly segment from 26th to 6th Avenues. And in this area where you see a lot of the colors happening, the more active land uses, the more commercial corridor is actually Colfax Avenue in Original Aurora, which may not surprise you. So in fact, Havana is more of a residential corridor in this area. So we will definitely take that context into consideration when we think about the future improvements to Havana corridor, that it is a residential corridor. And then also important connections to Colfax, knowing that, the future bus rapid transit system along Colfax is coming, and there is zoning there to support a more walkable and mixed use environment at Colfax. So looking at connections to Colfax from Havana. Next slide. The next segment from 6th down to Iliff is the longer portion of the corridor, and it is known as a city corridor in Aurora Places. And so the future vision of this portion of Havana is mixed use in nature, but also recognizing that it is a commercial corridor. So there are a lot more auto-oriented uses here. You see a lot of the auto dealerships and auto parts stores and gas stations and things like that. This is where the Havana Business Improvement District is very active. This is where the Highline Canal Trail is, and you've got lots of parks and open space. So trails and connections to those important green spaces are important to consider. And then there are quite a few catalysts, such as the Argenta development happening at first in Havana, and some others along the corridor. So we will take those into consideration when we think about future land uses. Gardens on Havana is another hot spot on the corridor that is a great place for the community to gather. And next slide. And then finally, towards the south is what the plan refers to as an urban district. This is potentially what could see the most change in terms of the future vision of the corridor. So this is south of Iliff, from Iliff to Dartmouth. And in this area, it is, again, quite auto-oriented. It's got the intersection of Parker Road in there. But the future vision of this area is a higher density area with lots of jobs, lots of opportunities for people to live and work and play in the area. So it will be fun to think about the future potential in this area, both in terms of land use and transportation and connections. That's all I have. Any questions
Sorry
on
about
land
that.
use?
Yeah.
Cheney, we
was-
do have a question for you. Someone had asked about, what about some more mixed use, high density development along the corridor? Do you see opportunities for that?
Yeah, that's something we will look at for sure. And the zoning does, is reflective of the vision, and we will kind of look back and forth to make sure, and we will make any zoning recommendations. We will look for opportunities for nodes and potential future mixed use developments like Gardens on Havana to create more of those experiences along the corridor, recognizing that the entire 6-lane corridor is not feasible to be a mixed use, corridor the entire way, but we certainly want to look for those opportunities to transform over time.
Great, and we've got 2 more. The first one, could you orient us to where is downtown Aurora, as we're referring to?
Yeah, if you go back to original Aurora, 2 slides ago. Yeah, so generally, if you can drag the cursor over that yellow dashed line, because I don't think they can see my cursor. Yes, that is downtown.
Excellent. And then are there opportunities to build affordable housing in the urban district or city corridor?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is certainly, there is quite a bit of affordable housing in the corridor today, but not directly on the corridor. And that's something that when we talk about multimodal corridors and connections to transit and having the Havana corridor and the RTD line be one of the busiest, affordable housing is certainly something that we are interested in pursuing.
Great. And then one more did come in, and this is down in the weeds a little bit more, but are bike racks, do you know, in your review of the conditions, are they a requirement of commercial development?
Yes, I believe that is a requirement in zoning. I am not 100% sure. I don't have it in front of me, but it should be.
Yeah, this individual agreed with you. They just wanted to affirm.
Yeah, Cheney, this is Tom Worker Braddock. I'm a senior transportation planner with the City of Aurora. Right now, we do have a requirement to have bike racks be part of any new commercial development. I believe it's either up to 10% or 15 bike racks, whatever is less. And then those bike racks, a portion of those bike racks have to be located within easy viewing distance of the major entrance of the development. So part of commercial development, and I should say new development. So if there's existing development out there, they wouldn't be required to put bike racks in until they redevelop.
Thank you, Tom. So when you say 10%, is the 10% of the total parking spaces?
Correct. So if there's 100 parking spaces, there would have to be 10 bike racks.
Thank you.
And I'm just seeing one more comment and question about Del Mar Parkway. Even though it is a residential area, it's problematic crossing Havana. You are not the first to bring that up, and we will certainly be looking at that intersection. It is a major intersection in the original Aurora, so yes.
All right, any other questions that we should address at this point, Anne?
The last follow-up would be probably for Tom. Do you know if the required bike racks are the inverted U bike racks?
They are the inverted U bike racks. We do have specifications about the type of bike racks that we want in zoning. So inverted U, anti-theft deterrent.
Great. All right. So at this point, we are going to show you what you tell us what we heard from you. If my
And Jen, as you dive into this, I'm just going to say the dialogue has been healthy, and we are up to 49 mix of comments and questions, and even a couple more as I'm saying that. So I tried to compile a couple themes at the beginning, and then everyone's exact comments are below for you to dig into.
All right. Well, thank you, Anne, for your hard work behind the scenes. Much appreciated. So Anne has identified some themes within the comments and what you guys have told us, which is that walking on narrow sidewalks is dangerous and uncomfortable. I think we would all agree with you on that. That there's not enough safe spots to cross, and it's challenging or dangerous to cross so many lanes. This gets to Ted's point where he talks about having refuge islands for pedestrians and other avenues to try and make it safer for pedestrians to cross the road. The vehicle speeds are dangerous. At this point, I don't know if there's any plan to change the speeds on that road, but that's certainly something that we can have a conversation with the city and CDOT about. Transit is a key asset for this corridor, absolutely. And transit stops should have a sufficient amenities and be connected to the sidewalk. Absolutely, because without those connections, it's really hard for transit users to get where they need to go, particularly those that are disabled and can't jump over a curb or bumpy sidewalks. So looks like we have a load of questions here. We're not going to go through all of those today, but we will take all of this input into consideration as we move forward with this study. And I just want to say that we really appreciate all of your feedback today. This is great. We are going to, we've got a little bit more to go in the presentation, but we have another question for you all. So we understand that right now you see the corridor as not safe, high speeds, basically not a place you necessarily want to walk. And so what we ask of you now is to tell us, in 10 years, how would you describe improved biking, walking, transit use, and driving in the Havana corridor study area? So again, if you can provide that feedback by using the Q&A button below or by texting us at 720-270-9041. We have a little bit more to talk to you about, and then we will jump into your feedback on the vision for this corridor. So as we move forward, we anticipate that there will be a number of corridor-wide strategies that we will want to look at. We've discussed how the corridor is varied and that it has very different characteristics along the corridor, but there are some things that we think could be implemented corridor-wide. And some of the things that we may explore include bus rapid transit for transit improvements, things like separated bike lanes. As Ted mentioned, that could include flexible delineators or a narrow curb that would protect the bike from the vehicles. We will consider mid-block crossings and ways to get the pedestrians across the street more safely. And we'll consider improvements that would also help the vehicle, things like smart signals or intelligent transportation systems. So there's signal capabilities that allow for the signal to operate in real time. And basically what it does is it watches the traffic and it identifies when there's an approach that doesn't have a lot of cars at it, and it will turn red for that approach to give the green time to the other approaches where there's more traffic. So that's something that we'll consider along this corridor as well. Through this process, we have identified a number of focus areas. These are areas that have identifiable challenges or characteristics that make them a potential high priority for additional focus during our next phase. And some of those areas are identified here. You have the red line. So this is this entire section from Montview down to 6th Avenue and from Mississippi to Iliff. Those are two segments that we have identified as being somewhat problematic. And that is based off of the crash data and all of the existing conditions that we've talked about so far. We've also identified some intersections that are somewhat problematic based on that data, and those are identified with the purple stars. So you have Colfax, 1st Avenue, Exposition, Mississippi, Florida, Iliff, and Parker. So as I mentioned, the things that we looked at to identify these focus areas included crash rates, long delays for vehicles or transit, high bike ped or vehicle traffic, high transit ridership, locations where you have a lack of amenities, or important opportunities for development or redevelopment. So hopefully Anne has had a few minutes to.
Yeah, and Jen, before you pull it up, let's pause for a minute and maybe just repeat this question, see if we can get a couple more.
Okay.
So the question again was, in 10 years, what would be the description of an improved biking, walking, transit use, and driving experience on the Havana corridor study area? We've gotten a few responses.
Sorry, I should have taken longer to get through those slides.
That's all right. I think I'm not seeing anything necessarily new come in, so you can go ahead and pull it up. But
All right. All right, so what we're hearing so far, and feel free to continue to provide us some responses. We, again, will incorporate all of the input that you provide to us. So what we're hearing is autonomous vehicles is key. That is something that we know is coming. We don't know when. And I know that there's certain things that CDOT and possibly even the city, Carly might be able to chime in on this, but I know that there are some agencies that are including wider striping between the lanes, which is what's needed for those autonomous vehicles. And the city may be doing that as well. More of a complete street architecture for Havana, where the corridor is after for all user and less autofocus. So less autofocus, more thinking about the other users, which is the direction that we're heading at this point because we do have limited right-of-way. So we've got to basically use what we've got and work with that. Safe, enjoyable, and a variety of dining options along with housing on the corridor. And the infamous road diet, that's a scary word for some. And Ben Keeney from CDOT might be cringing at that at the moment, but this person is saying that traffic would divert to I-225 and remove a number of the two-way left turn lanes and replace those with a median. So, you know, I like the way you guys are thinking. We appreciate all of the comments and thoughts that you guys have. A lot of these are things that we've talked about internally. We do know that there's some stakeholders that are more open to it and others who are not so open to those options. And as we move forward, we'll have to figure out what that balance looks like. So thank you for those.
Jennifer, this is Ted here. I don't know if it's possible, but subsequent to opening it, a couple of additional responses did come in.
Okay.
Are you able to go back to the slide and show those, or we can? Okay.
Maybe. Hold on a second. Let's try this. Thank you. I have another way to get to it. Hold that thought for 1 second.
And I will be showing all of these on the site. So if it's not functioning now, we can move on.
Okay. Nope, I got it. So the latest one was I'd like to see bikeways along the corridor with few stop signs, so that cyclists are not stopping at every block. Thoughts on that, Ted?
No, it's just that let's not do it now. A couple others did come in, and
Okay.
I don't see them here, but again, they will be shared on the website after the meeting. So,
If you'd like to mention those out loud, please feel free, Ted.
sure. Diego Fleming indicates that First Avenue experiences a lot of cars for being a small intersection, so that's a very site-specific observation. And then Tom Tobiasen indicates that, there are a lot of apartments located immediately on the corridor, and several of those are some of the most affordable in the region, he indicates. And yet residents of a lower income status living there are, if you think about their access and their safe ability to walk and bike on the corridor, Tom is suggesting that they are unfairly treated because they are on an everyday basis forced to deal with these difficult and often dangerous conditions. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
That's a fair assessment, excuse me. All right, well, thank you for that, Ted.
Yeah.
All right. So our process for this project, we are currently in phase 2. Phase 1, we looked at the existing and future conditions, and phase 2 is the corridor vision, branding, and land use piece of this. So we're kind of working on these two pieces together, and each of these purple stars represents an opportunity for stakeholder input. So we are at the first purple star right here today. As I mentioned a couple times during this meeting, we will have an opportunity, you will have an opportunity to provide us input on potential alternatives. So as of right now, that's looking like probably in the February timeframe that we would come back to you with some suggestions and thoughts on how we might address some of these conditions along the corridor. And then during phase 4, probably sometime in June of 2021, we would come back with those final recommendations so you could see where we went with everything. So next steps for opportunities and input, we would really appreciate if you all would go to the project website at auroragov.org/Havana Street Corridor Study. We've got a survey up there. The existing conditions report is up there. We have a newsletter that kind of dives into a summary of what's going on. And we will, if you could maybe chime in on MetroQuest and give folks an idea of what we're doing with that.
Sure. So MetroQuest is a platform that we're also going to be using to allow people to give us location-specific input on a map. So some of you brought up intersections where you felt it was congested, or particular bus stops where you felt like the services to the bus stop were insufficient. So that'll give you an opportunity to put that on a map and share those ideas with us. And then down the line, we'll also hope to use that tool to come show you some of the design considerations and alternatives as they get more fully baked through the process. So check back to the website for that information, because that feedback would be great, and we'd really appreciate all the participants today adding to that, and then also sharing it broadly with anyone else who can provide input.
Excellent. Thank you, Anne. So I guess at this point, Huilong, is there anything else that you would like to share with our attendees? If not, maybe we could dive into some additional questions if there are some.
Maybe I just want to emphasize that this is a transportation study, and so this is the first step to identify plans and actions that will need to be taken in the future for specific improvement. So this also will serve as a very good basis for us to apply for federal grant, or maybe work with CEDA and regional partners to apply for grant for implementation. So this is a critical step to really link the plan, vision to implementation.
Thank you. So Anne, do we have some more questions, or Ted, if you're both watching, are there some questions that we might want to try and address before we get off the call today? We've got about 15 minutes left.
I'm not tracking any additional. Let me take a look back. And while we're doing that, while I'm just checking back through these, one other thing that we brought up at the beginning of this is that there is a survey out right now. And I just checked, and we do have 49 responses. We'd love to get up into the hundreds. So we're 15 minutes ahead of schedule. That is plenty of time to complete the survey and share it with a friend. So we'd welcome you guys doing that to help us get the word out even further. So I'm looking back, and one that I did find, one additional question is just is there a plan to update the Aurora Bike Ped Master Plan? And is there an opportunity to integrate this existing condition information with that?
I'm going to turn that over to either Huilong or Tom if they're aware of any updates that are planned for the Bike Ped network.
Yes, I think, Tom, go ahead, please.
Okay. Yes, we are in the process of the very beginning process of updating the Bike Ped plan. The last one was created in 2012, so it's well past time for it to be updated. And any information that we identify, or any future improvements that we identify through the Havana study, will be incorporated and reinforced in the updated Bike Ped plan.
Thank you, Tom.
And also, I was wondering, since we have staff member from CDOT and RTD, if there are any specific questions you would like them to address from the attendees, you may input that information or question in the Q&A now, so they would have opportunity to you would have the opportunity to hear directly from them.
I would like to put Ben on the spot a little bit. Ben, when you heard the word road diet, what was your immediate thought?
So I guess it would, it would depend on where in the corridor, and can the future volumes still be supported by that reduced capacity. It's kind of how we would start looking at that.
Okay.
And there's other ways of making intersections more efficient too. You mentioned some like adaptive traffic signals. There's some other tools out there that we could explore, I think, too. So maybe you wouldn't use much bulk capacity per se.
Right.
So I think it's all in context.
Ben, I do have another question. When we talk about the through traffic lane, 11 feet is the typical width. What about the turning lanes, the left turns, right turns?
So far as reductions are, yeah, that's kind of site specific. I think we would have to look at those as they came up.
Okay, because basically there's always this either called the trade-offs, or maybe it's just called trade-off. Wider lane means longer crossing distance. So any foot is extra foot for the pedestrian to cross, and for the pedestrian to be exposed to traffic. So there's that is a trade-off.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's also the treatment of channelized islands, which can help with that issue as well.
Hey guys, this is Carly. I just want to note that a lot of the, at least left turn lanes, we've measured them for a few different projects now, and I've noticed that a lot of them are 10 feet, which is really the absolute minimum I think we'd want to go. So I know space is valuable, and we do want, to utilize all the space that we have to the best of its ability. I'm just not sure that there's a whole lot of space that we can take from these lanes. I mean, I think it's definitely worth looking into, but it's not like they're all designed, you know, maxed out right now, I guess, is just what I want to say.
So I think that, you know, it's also good to note that typically the congestion occurs at the intersection, and on the segment in between the intersections is people are generally traveling straight, so you have a little less congestion in those areas. So these potential solutions for mid-block crossings where you could maybe narrow the crossing distance, that's maybe something to consider as we move forward. We do have to address also the signalized intersections, because as it is, the distance between them is quite far for a pedestrian to walk, which is why you end up seeing a lot of people crossing mid-block. And so we need to add more, not less, locations for them to cross. So we, you know, we do have to make those signalized intersections safer, but it's possible that we might have even safer locations mid-block because they can be narrower with fewer lanes. So we'll keep that all in mind when we move forward with this.
That's a good point. So we saw two RTD questions. One is asking about the Route 105, whether there will be a service reduction for 105, and also asking about the articulated bus on Havana, if that's can be used. I don't know if Doug or Clara, you are able to speak about those two questions.
Yes, hi there. This is Clara with RTD. I can't speak to the articulated bus question. I'm not sure if that's resource management, if that's just, if they're all being utilized on even busier routes, I'm not sure. As for planned service reductions for the Route 105, we are not looking at the Route 105 for the upcoming service change. And I wanted to let you know that the service change proposals was just put up on RTD's website, and I can share that in the chat. Excuse me, I can share that in the chat.
Thanks, Clara. Actually, I don't know if the chat should be disabled, so I don't know that everybody will be able to see that, but that might be something that we can tie to the project website. If you can send that to us, that'd be great, and we'll share it.
Will do.
I do see a question here about pedestrian bridges or tunnels. Carly, or yes, Carly, maybe, do you have any thoughts, or are you aware of any consideration for bridges or tunnels on this corridor?
I'm not aware of any planned projects we have with a bridge or a tunnel on this corridor. I think in general, you know, obviously when you're separating the mode completely, it could be a safer alternative. It's just really hard with right-of-way. We've mentioned that we're very constrained with right-of-way, and even with a really small bridge, for those to be, you know, ADA compliant, you might need just a bigger footprint than I think what people are generally thinking. And just looking at the corridor, I don't see where that would fit in. Also, I'd say, with just related to, you know, bridges in general, you know, we'd have to look at where we would place those pretty carefully, because a lot of times, you know, people are kind of like water. They take the path of least resistance, and we could put up a bridge somewhere and people will still prefer to run across the road instead of going upstairs. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you know, something that's, I think, always in our minds as an alternative to evaluate. It's just hard with cost and right of way generally to fit those in environments that are already developed, like Havana.
And Carly, this is Tom Worker Braddock. I will point out for the attendees that it's not this corridor, but we are looking forward to putting in a pedestrian overpass bridge across Parker Road at the 9 Mile Station. The city was successful getting that TIP grant application, and this last round, TIP grant is federal money that cities have to compete for in order to receive. And I think construction should be starting on that bicycle and pedestrian bridge on 2022 or 2023.
That's a good point. Thanks, Tom.
We also have another land use question and kind of urban design question. Are there any new urbanism developments in Aurora? And if so, where? Or if not, why not? So Cheney, I don't know if you have any examples that come to mind or anyone else.
Yeah, I actually used to serve as vice president for the Colorado New Urbanist chapter. I am sure that they exist. You know, Stapleton and Lowry are considered New Urbanist developments. I'm sure there are others. But that is a type of development in terms of providing housing options and walkability near transit that would be desirable. And I do believe the updated zoning code does support that for Aurora. It is possible.
Cheney, this is George Adams. I also wanted to mention there's a greenfield project out closer to the airport called Painted Prairie, which certainly has some elements of new urbanism involved in it. It's, you know, the connection to transit is a work in progress, I guess you would say, but it does have a wide variety of housing types. There's a fair amount of commercial development that will be walkable to the residential uses. So I would just wanted to point that one out as well.
And folks, that was George Adams, Director of Planning for Aurora.
Thanks, Tom.
And this is Chance on Havana Street with the bid. I just wanted to note and share, just because I know there's a lot of other residents and neighborhood representatives on this call or this conference. A lot of Havana is actually up for sale. Quite a few of the property owners have listed their properties, and so we're expecting a lot of new developments and opportunities. We'll be working with the multimodal study, of course, but many of these properties have not been developed, and a lot of them were owned by family trusts, and now we're seeing a lot of them actually putting their properties on the market. So there will be a lot more to share in the next 4 to 6 months in regards to new developments along the corridor.
So we did get another question about potentially for RTD, Clara. They're asking how population density affects transit. Thoughts about how it might specifically affect the 105 or transit on this corridor?
Maybe another RTD question just for Claire or Doc can answer together, or asking about the 15L bus stop beneath the Iron Bridge west of I-225 on the north side of Colfax. I think the question is whether that can the stop can be moved beneath the bridge. This would result in better lighting, more width, and get folks out of the rain.
Of course, to address the 15L bus stop relocation question first, I can forward that to our bus stop department, but all changes like that would have to be ADA compliant. And so I don't know off the top of my head if that location is already, but that is a consideration. And as to transit and population density, those go together very well. It is a lot easier to serve higher populations if they're dense and they're near a transit stop, and we can certainly serve more people that way, as opposed to, for example, with like suburban sprawl, it is a lot more difficult to serve people.
Thanks, Clara. So we are about at time, 7:29. I want to again thank all of you for your participation tonight. We really, really, really appreciate it. You know, we consider this a great turnout, and all of your questions are very valuable to the process. That being said, if you do have additional questions, you can go to the project website, and Huilan's email is here on this page, but it's also located on the project website along with my email and Tom Worker Braddock's email. So if you have additional questions, you want to reach out to us, please feel free, and check back regularly to the project website for any updates. Thank you all for coming, and have a great evening.
And take the survey.